Right. So.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Lemay, co-president of LYA, and I am joined by Robert Yates, who's also with me at LYA, and we welcome you to our showcase today on Wednesday, October 14th. We'll tell you a little bit about ourselves if you're not familiar with us, and we'll touch base on the recently concluded US CBRS auction and a perspective on the value of shared licenses in the prime 5G band. And we have a little bit of data analysis to show you, and that which I think could enlighten you in terms of thinking about what's the value of the 3.5 band and what's the value for mobile carriers and for other types of carriers of this band when it is actually shared with higher priority users, as is the case with CBRS. So I will start just to spend a few minutes highlighting who we are at LYA, and then we will get into the key subject matter of the CBRS band. So if I could have the next slide, please. Introduction to LYA, the next slide as well. So LYA, we've been around since 1993, so it's been quite a while. And we provide consulting services and very much focused on spectrum and auctions to the telecommunications industry, and that includes carriers, investors, and regulators. We bring significant expertise in and innovation. We believe in broadband spectrum and auctions. We are a boutique consulting firm, but we certainly have a broad scope of experience and expertise to bring. I just want to highlight actually on this page, and we won't show too much about that today, but we do have extensive tools that we use in the context of our spectrum and auction practice, a valuation model, and an NPV engine is what we call it, where we can certainly help our clients assess the value of individual blocks or additional spectrum or whole bands. And we've been doing this for quite a few years for both carriers and investors. We have an auction management tool which has been used extensively, for example, in the US auctions, even in the recent CBRS auction and the upcoming RDOF auction for those of you that are familiar with this. So we certainly can take on auctions with many thousands and thousands of items for sale in terms of helping you manage through the auction. And also, LYA has developed its own mock auction platforms that we support all the key formats out there: SMRA, combinatorial clock auction that, as was done for CBRS, for example, and as will be done for the C-band auction. And they're quite extensive with very good user interface. And we won't go into the details of that today, but if you are interested, you can just contact us and we could actually show them to you. They're all web-based and they're very user-friendly. If we can go to the next slide, please. So you have here the three pillars, if you want, of our company and the three types of activities that we do, a whole range of consulting, strategic consulting activities on the left-hand side. In the center, what I've talked about in the focus of this conference, which is spectrum and auction, and including all the tools and the valuation exercises that we do. I also mentioned that we're quite active also with respect to, for example, IoT services via satellite, so not just terrestrial wireless, but also satellite applications. And another thing that we do is the private auctions. LYA has on a number of occasions been very successful in helping carriers dispose of specific licenses or tower assets, or even the entire company. And over the last few years, we've actually done quite a bit of work and mandates, and successful mandates, in helping companies dispose of assets in the 3.5 gigahertz band. Next slide, please. This is an overview of our recent activities in spectrum and auction. I think we did our first auction in 1999, so we don't put them all on this slide. but you can see that we've done many auctions in Canada, in the US, in Ireland, and some private sales for the last 4 years. So we've been quite active. We've also been helping carriers developing their spectrum, 5G spectrum strategies for a number of years now, since the start of 2017, and as well as develop new auction formats for specific purposes. So if we can go to the next slide. You have here a write-up of who I am, many years of expertise and experience in telecommunication carrier and telecommunication services and consulting for now, more than 20 years. And the same thing for the next slide is Mr. Yates, Robert Yates, my partner in LYA, who brings also, a few decades of experience in telecommunications. If we go to the next slide. In many instances, we also help our clients in regulatory consultations, and you have here a few examples of recent reports that we have done. The first report, which you can find at the link in here, was actually submitted to the FCC last fall regarding an auction format that had been proposed to award the C-band. So it's a critique of an auction format that had been put forward, and you can find the entire report there. It was submitted to the FCC as part of an ex parte presentation and reviewed with all the commissioners and the Wireless Bureau. The second one also discusses the 3.5 gigahertz band, but it was submitted to the Canadian government as part of a consultation on the rearrangement of that band. And the third one, the third link here is with respect to certain auction rules associated with the upcoming Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, the RDOF auction, and some suggestions for change that we had put forward to the FCC. Next slide, please. So CBRS PAL auction, the main subject of our discussion here. And I have to say that LYA had helped a client prepare for the CBRS auction, but the auction is over, and we have some discussion of some of the results of the prices paid for CBRS, and what are the conclusions that we can draw from the, what do mobile carriers think of shared spectrum? How did they participate? What were they willing to pay for spectrum in that auction, and as opposed to other types of carriers, like there was extensive participation in the auction. So we are drawing some conclusions and some comparisons here, which you might find useful. So Rob, do you want to go and continue on that?
Sure, yeah, I'll pick it up there, thank you. So we, as Joanne kind of alluded to, the auction 105 is completed, so we're no longer in the quiet period. There's been so many auctions being run in the US this year that we're kind of in a constant quiet period. So we won't talk about RDOF, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, but we can talk about the CBRS PAL auction. So if we go to the next slide, what we thought just before we throw a lot of numbers out, just to make sure we're all on the same page, and some of this has been presented in other forums so far, but just to be clear of what we're referring to, and when Joanne talks about it as having an element of sharing, what we mean by that. Basically, CBRS, which is the acronym, and we like to make sure that everyone's clear on acronyms too. The Citizens Broadband Radio Service, which is 100 megahertz or 150 megahertz from 3550 to 3700, and it has three user tiers, basically, or a tiered access model, they call it. So tier one are incumbents, which are primarily radar from aircraft carriers. So a lot of the coastal areas impacted by federal users. There's some satellite earth stations and things, but a lot of the areas that are impacted by the incumbents are radar from aircraft carriers. So the obvious places, that are impacted by that, San Diego, Puget Sound, and things like that. So you can't bump an aircraft carrier, right? It's a big thing, and you can't tell them to go away. So they have priority access. They have the first level access to it, and they always allowed to use the band. What was auctioned are called priority access licenses. So PALs. PALs are effectively licensed spectrum, but subject to the fact that they could get impacted by tier one users for the time when the radar signal gets turned on maybe you're not allowed to use the frequency for a specific amount of time while the radar is active. So the priority access is what the FCC auctioned in auction 105. And as you'll note at the top, the band is 150 megahertz, but actually the priority access licenses, there's only 70 megahertz of them. So basically the FCC decided that there should be 7 PALs basically per area, where the area was defined as a county, and with a subject to a 4 PAL channel limit. So any one bidder in the auction could buy up to 4 PALs out of the 7 available, and the remaining is the tier 3 users, which are general access, which effectively, assuming all the PALs are awarded, that they have the remaining part of it, which is 80 megahertz, 70 plus 80 is 150. And generalized authorized access is sort of, as I said, licensed by rule, which is like effectively like Wi-Fi, but it's a bit more stringent than that, since they do actually have to register with the SAS and which I'll explain in a second, but in order to operate. So it's not quite like Wi-Fi, but it's licensed to rule, meaning that basically as long as the equipment is approved, you can use the frequencies in conjunction, accepting interference and the other rules associated with relatively unlicensed service. So for purpose of our discussion, there's the entire range, 3550 to 3700, but the PALs are what we're interested in terms of market value, and that was 70 megahertz out of the total range. So next slide. So where does this all fits in a broader context? We thought this might just to frame it up, and this is highly oversimplified, but clearly there's a question of the generations of equipment, and there's a question of different frequency ranges and ecosystems and things. So when we look globally, and this is sort of a North Americanized chart, but of the context of evolution to 5G, clearly, for example, in the middle part here in 4G, worldwide, the 2500 megahertz range has been largely deployed for 4G or LTE, and which is the case in North America as well. Now, obviously, all of these bands can accommodate 5G protocols, but once you have a full use of the band, you need sort of fresh spectrum in order to load up a new ecosystem. So we kind of shift focus. So in a sense, there are also primary bands for 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and there probably will be for 6G. But for 5G, what we're looking at are the new bands that can accommodate the new equipment and create the new ecosystem. So the 3500 is really critical in here because it's a range that provides new spectrum for these new devices. They say notwithstanding the fact that basically all the bands can be 5G bands at some point, but in order to accommodate new users without disrupting the existing ones, you need new spectrum. So effectively, there's a global focus on this mid-band range, highlighted in orange, so relevant to our CBRS discussion. And looking at sort of an objective of, say, 100 megahertz per operator in the mid-band and 1,000 megahertz in the millimeter wave. So the US now is clearly moving rapidly to get out ahead of that. It's been a long time coming, but basically now identified 530 megahertz of mid-band, so across the range, and 450 of it as licensed, and 80 megahertz of GAA, as we just talked about. And within that, obviously, the 70 megahertz of CBRS that we'll talk about. Now, clearly that, if you take the overall sort of 5G objective of 100 megahertz, that's pretty good for accommodating, at least 4 operators, let's say, in that level. So next slide. So without cluttering it up too much, again, just to sort of keep us when we're talking about values in the auction, is where do we fit in here? And so the CBRS band highlighted in the middle there is auction 105, is actually a 3GPP band, band number 48. And so band 48 actually encompasses both the PALs and the GAA, so the lighter part on the right. The GAA is also part of band 48. So you have that 150 megahertz that's international standard. As you can see, it overlaps very clearly with the international allocation. So band 42, 43, which were pioneer bands for 5G, which are still 4G, but are part of the broader ecosystem from 3400 to 3800. And then at the bottom, as you can see, the overall ITU approach, which is to grab the whole piece from 3300 to 4200. And there's a 3GPP band for that in 5G called band 77, which band 48 will fit into. So these are all TDD blocks, and that gives you the larger global context. And you can see in red as well the Canadian allocation, which shows effectively in the Canada-US context will be essentially close to fully aligned the question of the 3650 still outstanding, but basically, covering the similar ranges. So the new portion in the US below the CBRS band, 100 megahertz below it, the CBRS band itself, of which 70 is PAL, the 3650 to 3700 grandfathered from its former incarnation, now part of the GAA ecosystem, and as also band 48, and then the new C-band coming up in auction 107, which will take us up to 3980. So that creates the 530, and our CBRS piece, fits in the middle. And by the way, just as a small add, we'll be having a CBRS panel tomorrow, and I'm sure we'll get into all of these issues in great detail with some very big experts in the field. So, but just to give you the context before we talk about values. So if we go to the next chart. So here again, you can see the band 48 and how it fits in. So now we're just focusing on the 3500 range. And let's look at auction 105. For those of us that do auctions, we remember all the numbers. So auction 105 now is cast in stone for eternity as being the CBRS PAL auction. It was held in the summer and awarded 7 blocks, unpaired 10 megahertz blocks in each of 3,233 counties. 22,631 licenses for sale in each round. So this was a massive auction. It's not very often you have 22,000 things for sale all at once. So it was a huge success, actually. The first time, I think there was a very large number of bidders, very large number of licenses for sale. And it awarded, let's say, the 70 megahertz of the PAL in the middle of band 48. So go to the next chart. So on the next page, we have the, oh, there we go. Okay. So we'll start getting into some numbers since that's what we said we'd talk about. So basically, this was a multi-round auction. So as in any multi-round auction, the price starts at a low opening bid. So in this case, it was 2 cents per megahertz pop, and it goes up round by round. It took 76 rounds for this to play out. So totally not an unreasonable number of rounds. And 228 bidders. In fact, bought pretty much almost all the licenses. There's a few leftovers. That's a little bit unusual in an FCC auction. Usually people buy everything, but there were a few leftovers with 20,000 items. It's not too surprising that some would have been unsold. So 20,625 were sold. And the top 5 bidders, again, this is not totally unusual either. They accounted for about 86% of the proceeds. Usually if you take the top 5 or say top 10, 80-20 kind of rule, 80% of the auction. So here you've got the top 5 accounting for 86%. And Verizon clearly the biggest focus here of 1.9 billion in winning bids, 41% of the whole auction. And you can see their average megahertz bought on the side. So you remember we said that they were capped at, they couldn't buy more than 4 PALs, so 40 megahertz. So you can see here obviously it's an average, so the averages as usual never exist, but you can see, for example, Dish at 17.6 would have 10 in some markets, 20 in others, perhaps 30 in some, things like that, for an average of 17.6. See, Charter came out pretty uniform, pretty close to 20 everywhere. And so you get an idea of who was focusing on this, how many licenses they bought. The average overall was 21.69 cents per megahertz pop. I will show you that compares to some international benchmarks. That was very close to what we had assessed pre-auction. We thought it would be in that range, and it was. And again, it went from an opening bid of 2 cents. We go to the next chart. So on the next page, a slight delay in our system. There we go. Okay. So there were 4.6 billion in revenues. Actually, interestingly, there was about 8.4% of it on counties that were undervalued, so at 10 cents. So as usual, again, the averages, we can look at averages and they're useful to compare with other auctions, but as you can see here, as in many cases, there's quite a wide variety when we're looking at 22,000 licenses across 3,000 counties. Obviously they're not all the same. So you got about half of them, if you take it megahertz pop. So what's for sale in the auction are megahertz pops. About half was for more than 10 cents. About 92% of the overall auction revenues. So obviously those megahertz pops were seen to me as more valuable than the others, and that accounted for most of the revenues. And it's quite a wide range. So the larger counties, so Miami-Dade at 35 cents, seemed to be relatively undervalued, up to Orange County in California at 91 cents. And the most expensive ones were actually some very small ones, but that's because they had a dollar amount and very small population. So next slide. So the next slide just provides a little segue to that point. Who were the bidders that were interested? So here we've sort of thrown a few on since our audience here in terms of spectrum management. Who are the major players, the Verizons and Dish and whatnot, what they bought, how many counties they have, how many licenses, their average megahertz again, and the net bid. So you can see there are other players here. There was a big focus by big cable, if you will, at Charter, Comcast, and Cox all went in here. Some of the smaller cable guys weren't there, but the larger ones certainly were very present. There's a whole bunch of WISPs. We put one here, AMG, which is an interesting smaller company. You can see they did quite well and bought 491 counties for 28 million in net bids. They actually got a rural bidder discount, unlike the other parties on this chart. So their gross bids were a bit more than what I showed there. And then other, the smaller sort of telco providers like the US Cellular was certainly present as well. Oh, there we lost our screen there.
Could we get back to the screen with the charts? Hello?
A small technical glitch.
Hi, sorry about that. My presentation laptop was just briefly come off, but I'll bring it back up for you guys now. 2 seconds.
Okay.
Sorry about that, guys.
You take us at page 17, we find because we did the page 16. So. Sorry for the slight delay, the glitch.
I guess we can keep talking without looking at the charts. I think one of the things that is very interesting is the differences in prices paid by some of the largest bidders if you compare on a per megahertz pop. So the previous slide, please.
16 years.
Yeah. So and you can see that Verizon was at. It's hard to see the number here, but it's close to 40 cents per megahertz pop, while Dish, in the top markets, well, for example, Dish was more at 15 cents per megahertz pop because they had, certainly a totally different strategy than what Verizon did, where they focused on some of their key markets. Same thing here, Charter, obviously because of some of the markets where they operate in, had, paid a price actually similar to Verizon, even though Charter, is not, an MNO. Yeah, they have an MVNO, but they're not an MNO, and Comcast ended up somewhere below 20 cents, so a little bit lower than the overall auction average. So it's quite interesting to see the differences in prices paid, and Rob will talk more about that on the next chart.
Yeah, well, yeah. So we go to the next chart. Yeah, so you can see there's a quite, even though there's an overall average, which is useful for comparing, but in the U.S. auctions, particularly with all the regions, there's quite a big variation around. What the pricing is, which you can see fairly clearly from these bidders, a selection of larger ones plus AMG. Out of interest to show you a smaller one. So you can see on this chart too that, as you recall from the earlier point, that some of the opening bid was 2 cents. You can see that a lot of them were actually awarded at 2 cents, some of the smaller markets, and the larger ones, being relatively large. So as Joanne mentioned, Charter, obviously in some larger markets, so Queens and Kings, which are obviously Queens, New York, and Brooklyn, went for a fairly substantial price, as did LA and San Diego. So if we go to the next chart. Yeah, so this one, so just to throw a bunch of other numbers, and we won't dwell on these too much, but just to show you, here's Comcast, Charter, what their largest markets were. Not too unsurprising, Cook County, Illinois, obviously Chicago is one of the usually, hotbeds of spectrum auctions, often has the highest price in the auction. Same with LA, is a similar dynamic. So you got Chicago and LA showing up there, Harris, which of course is Houston, and Miami, King, Washington, so Seattle, some larger markets for Comcast. And you can see that the most expensive ones are quite interesting too, actually, $1.25 and things like that are very much at the upper end. So when we say that the averages don't exist, they kind of jump off the page here. You can't really find one that's actually at the average amount. So the top 5 markets, so clearly, these bidders looking at the top markets, converging around the 50, 60 cent range, and then the smaller markets, so down to the opening bid, and on average, and some of the most expensive ones, not necessarily the largest markets, but end up being a lot per megahertz pop.
Yeah, if I can say also, I think some of the interesting comparisons here is that out of these 4 bidders here, the only one now that is and has been a very successful mobile carrier is Verizon. So you can see what they were willing to pay for that spectrum. They have no other, really, not a lot of mid-band spectrum. They don't have the 2.5 gigahertz band because it's all T-Mobile that has that spectrum. So so this possibly they view this auction as important to de-risk their future participation in a C-band auction. But we also see the valuation from AMG, which is a fixed wireless operator. They obviously paid overall quite a lot less for the spectrum, but since they tend to operate outside of the major cities, they ended up with quite a few good deals to provide or deploy CBRS spectrum. But it's also interesting that their most expensive market was a market in Nebraska, a county in Nebraska, DeVal County, for $3.3 per megahertz pop. So in that's quite a lot for mid-band spectrum. Overall, the actual number was small, but that was their most expensive market on a per megahertz pop basis.
Yeah, so we thought this chart, the upper part of the chart kind of shows you sort of consistency across the cable targeting of markets and what they were doing, and similar conclusions on values. And the bottom chart kind of just contrasts, as Joanne's kind of implying, so the large mobile incumbent versus sort of a small rural-oriented WISP, and sort of give you the range of valuations, which is kind of interesting. We can then look at, so if you go to the next chart, if we look at, so this actually gives us some more comparisons across other countries. Again, bearing in mind the 2169, as we saw from the other pages, it goes from 2 cents to $1 something. So it's you have to be careful with averages. Most of the other countries here, the licensing is national, so that Ireland wasn't, but most of them are. And Canada's regional as well. So you've got the opening bids for next year's auction in Canada there. But the interesting thing about this chart, I mean, other than Italy, which Italy has a reputation for having very strange auctions and very high prices. So if you take them off of the chart as an outlier, you can see really clearly the sort of 20 cent range, if you will, 20 cent US per megahertz pop. Kind of target almost across the board. Spain and Ireland being somewhat lower, but the others are pretty consistently in that range, which is kind of interesting because this is the kind of numbers we had looked at before, and it did seem to be logical as a trend. Again, leaving out Italy as kind of a large outlier. Now Ireland is a very interesting case as well, and they were sort of the first out of the blocks. The timing of that auction was, as we said here, 2017. At the end of 2016, you might recall that was when the EC in Europe sort of pronounced on the 3.4 to 3.8 range as being a pioneer range for the 5G deployment. And so Ireland had just by coincidence happened to be doing its auction at the same time. So the bidders that won in that auction got a really good deal on the spectrum, as they were right in at the opening. In a sense, this is the start of our 5G era for this mid-band, and so Ireland was first out of the blocks, and came in at a very low price. The UK very quickly, it came up close to the 20 cents. South Korea and whatnot, Australia, and you can see the US one fits right in with that. And France was just completed a couple weeks ago, a bit lower, but 16 cents it was a competitive bid process as well. I think it ran about 3 days, but that came in sort of in the ballpark as well. So anyway, that should give you some idea of ranges of values.
Well, yeah. Now, if I can say, you see the recent French award at 16 cents US equivalent. What you have on the right-hand side in gray is the opening bids that have been set up by the Canadian government for the upcoming the auction of 3.5 gigahertz spectrum in Canada next June. And it's interesting to see that the highest price there is for about 3 or 4 of the top markets, close to 19 cents US per megahertz pop. So that's actually pretty close to the average of the US auction after the end of the auction, of course. But it's still well below prices paid for some of the major markets, which we've shown have gone from like 48 to 91 cents. So there's certainly room to grow. But it's higher than the prices paid for the national licenses in France, and that's the opening bid. So there's a lot of different perspective maybe on the value of this spectrum among regulators.
The land of expensive spectrum, yeah. So we'll see where that heads. I should have mentioned all the numbers here. It doesn't say here. They're all stated in U.S. dollars. So and in some cases at PVP exchange rates, but they're in in US dollars. So that's why the Canadian small market one's actually 5 cents Canadian, if you wanted to check us out on that, but they're all in US dollars. So just so with that in mind, then some observations on the final chart. Go to the next one. We sort of trying to take all that together in a very brief amount of time, but interestingly, the aggregate valuation from the CBRS auction is similar to the overall averages we see in the international benchmarks. Keeping in mind, really importantly, that quite often the international auctions are national licenses. No idea what a national license would go for in the US. It would probably be pretty expensive. The difference in the US, when it's done on 3,233 counties, there's a wide range of values. So, anywhere from the opening bid of 2 cents up to, more than $3 in some areas, and to $1.25, we saw $2.50, things like that. The usual suspects were expensive, LA, New York, Brooklyn and Queens, whatnot, Cook County for Chicago, with many small markets at or just above the opening bid. So despite as we talked initially, where does it all fit in, and the PAL versus incumbent users and all that. So despite all that stuff, which admittedly one would have thought maybe that complication would have dampened interest, but with 200 and some bidders that won something, clearly that didn't deter most people. And the valuations kind of held effectively. Now there's some variation around that. If you think, where is it? I mentioned, basically ship-to-shore radar from aircraft carriers, which is a big deal when you're there with the radar. When the aircraft carriers there, it's a big deal. So what are the areas where aircraft carriers go? And clearly, San Diego, New Orleans, Norfolk, Jacksonville, maybe Pensacola, stuff like that. As you can see, there's really no obvious trend around those either. San Diego is probably the best known place for aircraft carriers. A friend of mine who lives there sent me a picture of one the other day. I mean, that's what they do in San Diego Harbor, is watch when the aircraft carriers come in, and that actually was one of the highest prices in the auction. So obviously the operators there are not deterred by the sharing mechanism in San Diego. On the other hand, look at Pensacola, it went almost for opening bid price. Now maybe Pensacola in general is a less interesting market than San Diego anyway, but there's no obvious, consistency around this in terms of, did the sharing regime cause a problem for people, targeting it in the auction? I think that's quite an interesting observation here, I think. So overall, I guess we can't say it's a fully conclusive result. Surely, it does seem that the operators felt the sharing regime was manageable, and, the different valuations there kind of play that out. One of the subtending things here that may help is that there's also the 80 megahertz of GAA everywhere. So the extent in these markets, even if you only have one PAL block and you paid a reasonable price for it, maybe you can count on additional spectrum using the GAA and use your anchor, use your PAL block as an anchor. Verizon clearly sees value in it. Maybe this, like a lot of these bands, you end up being a ecosystem. So like the 700C block was a Verizon ecosystem, and the lower 700 was AT&T ecosystem. Back in the day, this is maybe going to become a Verizon ecosystem band. T-Mobile actually did win a few, 6 counties, a couple of them at 2 cents. Not really a participant though, and clearly, as Joanne mentioned, they have all the 2.5 at the moment, so that's probably their main focus. And there's some good valuations here that until now, obviously the US heading towards the 530 is a big deal. Took a long time to get to the CBRS auction, and maybe there was some pent-up demand that played in there too. So anyway, that's kind of where we end up. I guess that was my cue that's the end of the presentation. So that's fine, which it is. So that's great. I don't know if there's questions at this point, or if someone's wants to chime in.
Yeah.
No.
But if there's no question, we hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we look forward to hearing back from you and to starting a conversation. And we thank you for your time and for taking the time to listen to this showcase, and hopefully you learned something and found it useful. So thank you very much.